and today we're reviewing the HyperTough 80015 12-volt brushless oscillating multi-tool. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the battery and battery slot, and for the most part it's a pretty good showing. Now this tool comes with a 1.5 amp hour battery, and while that is good enough for small and quick jobs, I would highly recommend upgrading to a 4 amp hour battery simply because tools like this will burn through a 1.5 amp hour battery very quickly. Now with that being said, the battery slot is also very good. There is zero looseness or play to speak of, and I've had zero issues with the battery falling free or any sort of interruption going to the motor from the battery having a loose connection or anything like that. So the battery slot is very good. About the only issue I have with this particular tool, and it's actually more of an issue with all the HyperTough 12-volt tools, is it can be a little bit challenging to disconnect the batteries from the tools simply because the tabs are on the stiff side. This will keep them from accidentally falling free, but if you're older and have limited hand strength, or younger and just have limited hand strength, this can be a little bit hard to, well, deal with if you need to change the battery out regularly. So, you know, just something to be aware of. So with this being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the, well, ergonomics of the tool, aka the handles and grips. For the most part, it's a pretty good showing. The rear grip features a lot of rubberized texture, and there are plenty of ridges and dips and grooves and everything else you might want on a rubberized grip, and it is fairly easy to maintain your control over this particular tool because it's not too, well, thick. So quite frankly, I'm very happy with the overall diameter of the grip, and I think it's a fairly easy tool to control. So no complaints there. And of course this particular tool also comes with a side handle which can be mounted on either the left or right side, which will help you maintain your control over this particular tool, especially if you're trying to be delicate or, well, if you just want better control. So really, I don't have any complaints over the handles, and I think it's a pretty good showing. Now, there is something about this particular tool that you should be aware of, and that would be the fact that it vibrates like, well, the dickens. Quite frankly, this thing is intense, and I would highly recommend wearing a pair of thick gloves. I don't think they put much effort forth in trying to reduce those vibrations from reaching your hands, and this thing is going to leave your hands numb if you are operating it for long periods of time without gloves. So, you know, I do think a nice pair of thick work gloves is a necessity when using this particular tool. I think my Ryobi multi-tool, which probably has about the same amount of vibrations that it's producing and the same, you know, level of intensity, does a much better job at, you know, isolating the vibrations from reaching your hands. And I also think my scaled 12-volt multi-tool does a better job. So, you know, I think HyperTough is, well, neglecting this particular area of the tool, and it is an area that they could make some vast improvements upon. So, you know, just something to be aware of. But other than that, I think the grips and ergonomics on this particular tool are just fine, and I don't have any other real complaints. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the controls, and for the most part it's a pretty simple showing. First up on top of the tool we have the on-off switch. It's a black plastic switch, and it's a pretty simple setup. It's located on top and in front of the grip, and you slide it forward to turn the tool on, and you slide it backward to turn the tool off. Really no complaints there, and it's super smooth, and it works just fine. And then on the side of the tool, on the left side to be precise, we have the speed control. 1 is going to be your slowest speed, and 6 is going to be your highest speed. There are plenty of different options in between those two speeds, and I think it works just fine for pretty much any of the standard intended purposes that you're going to be using a multi-tool with, for I should say. So, you know, no real complaints on the dial on the side either. It would have been nice if it was placed maybe a little bit higher and a little bit more forward, but, you know, its current placement doesn't really get in the way, and it's still easy enough to access one-handed. So, you know, for the most part, no real complaints there either. So for the most part, I think that this particular tool is adequate in pretty much all regards, and it gets the job done. Now, the one other kind of control or feature on this particular tool that I didn't cover earlier would be the battery indicator lights. There are 3 LED lights on the side of the tool, and they will basically turn off as the fuel age gets lower and lower. So when your tool is at, you know, 90% of the battery, it's going to have 3, 60% is going to go down to 2, 30% is going to go down to 1, and then when there are no lights on, well, obviously your tool is off. So, you know, pretty simple setup. With that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the blade clamp system. And, well, It's a blade clamp system, all right. I'm pretty sure Hypertough was drunk when they designed it because they definitely made some very interesting decisions. AKA, that's another way of saying stupid. First up, we have the little mechanism that, well, keeps you from pinching your fingers when you're trying to close the top, latch to pull the blade tight onto the tool. There's a little mechanism that pops up and gets in the way. You can see the little thing pop up, and you basically have to push it down with your fingers in order to, well, get the blade clamp lever back into the locked position. I'm not quite sure why they did that, and I think it's an incredibly stupid design, and it's definitely a major pain in the ass. So, this is not a great design. The handle itself is made out of a black plastic, and it feels rigid enough that I'm not too concerned about it. So, the handle is fine, but that little mechanism is not. Okay, now the next problem would be the blade bolt. Now the blade bolt itself is made out of metal and no complaints there. My problem is the fact that it doesn't screw to a point, or the furthest point that it can screw to is directly misaligned with the little metal posts that keep the blade from turning, and so when you tighten the blade, it comes down top of the posts instead of going down in between the posts, and this is a major pain because that other little mechanism up top means that it can be a little bit challenging in order to get everything lined up just right to get the blade locked in firmly and securely. So you basically have to have the blade bolt turn to a point where it can't turn too far or go too far back the other way because they'll become loose. It's a major pain in the neck, and when you couple it with the fact that there's no magnetic blade holder or no magnets to hold the blade in place, means that you also have to hold the blade at the same time. So you're basically having to do three things at once, and it just is not a great user experience. So Hypertough definitely needs to do a drastic redesign of their blade change system and make it actually user friendly on a future model if they ever release a future model. So the blade changing system on this particular tool, while it is nice that it is toolless, it might have actually been easier if it had been tooled to begin with. So quite frankly, this is definitely not a high point on this particular tool, and it is an area that could definitely use some improvements upon in the future. So with that being said, let's move on. Okay, last but not least, we have the LED light, and for the most part, it's decent enough. It's definitely not the brightest light in the market. My Skilled 12-volt multi-tool definitely has a brighter LED light, but at least it's there, and it does provide illumination, so, that is a nice feature. It features a single LED bead that is behind a diffused plastic cover, and it will provide enough light for you to be able to see by, as long as the multi-tool is fairly close to whatever you're trying to illuminate. So, it's a light. It works. No real complaints. I do think it could be brighter, but, it is what it is. Okay, the multi-tool without a battery, but with a blade and side handle attached, weighs 981 grams, which is a little over 2 pounds. And with a 1.5 amp hour battery, it weighs 1,161 grams, which is a little over 2.5 pounds. So it's a pretty lightweight tool. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this particular tool in use, and for the most part it was a pretty nice tool to use once you get past its shortcomings. When it comes to its ability to cut through wood, it's actually fairly decent, and it did a pretty good job at being able to carve away the edges on this coat rack that I was building, and I don't think I had really any major issues in its overall ability to, well, cut through the wood as long as you're using the right kind of blade. The amount of vibrations that this particular tool can produce is pretty impressive, but without the, well, dampening to prevent those vibrations from reaching your hand, it can definitely be a bit of a pain to use for long periods of time without wearing a nice pair of thick gloves, like I mentioned earlier in the video. But it was doing a fairly impressive job at being able to cut through the wood and take away all those rough edges, or, well, at least getting rid of the sharp edges that might damage a coat. After I was able to remove the wood, then I will go through and take down the remaining rough areas with a sander, but for the most part this particular tool is actually doing a pretty impressive job at, well, carving away wood. So, for the most part I was pretty happy with its performance in that regard. Now, that doesn't mean that this particular tool is going to be for everyone. I do think that this particular tool is going to be adequate enough for the average, hobby person who doesn't have to use it every day, but there are definitely aspects of this particular tool that would very much annoy me if I had to use it all the time. That mechanism that pops up and gets in the way is definitely a major pain when you are switching in between different blades, whether if you're going from a fine blade to a more, rough cut blade, or if you're going to, a sander attachment. that little mechanism is just a major pain. And when you couple it with the fact that you can't line up the stupid blade bolt just right because it doesn't actually, tighten to the point where it needs to tighten to get past the, the directional stumps on the bottom of the tool, it just is a bit of a pain. And for, the occasional use, it's something that I can live with. But, if I was having to work with it or do it all the time, I get very annoyed very quickly, and it just isn't worth the amount of time and hassle that, using a different multi-tool will, alleviate. I definitely think DeWalt has the market cornered when it comes to the ability to easily change the blades on a multi-tool, and this particular tool is definitely, towards the rear of the pack when it comes to just how annoying it is to change the blades on this particular tool. It definitely isn't as weird as that Works the multi-tool I reviewed, a year or two back was, but, for the most part, this particular multi-tool is, it's an interesting tool. Now, this particular tool does feature a brushless motor, which is a very nice feature to have, especially when you are using such a small battery. So, the brushless motor is a nice feature, and it is something that is, a selling point on this particular model. But, at the end of the day, your own personal needs and, desires are going to be what causes you to buy this particular tool or not buy this particular tool. And unfortunately, I just don't think that this particular tool exactly, makes itself, an appealing option to a lot of people out in the world. True, the price tag is going to be a little bit on the cheaper side. You get everything you basically need for around $60, and, that's a pretty good showing, especially for a budget tool with a brushless motor. But at the end of the day, I definitely think that there are better multi-tools that you could get for just a little bit more money. You could definitely get a fairly nice DeWalt multi-tool with a battery for around $100. And honestly, that would probably be the route I would go with if I don't need something that's ultra compact. You can also pick up a Ryobi multi-tool with 2 batteries for around $100 right now during the holiday season. And, that might not be a horrible option either, but that's going to have a brush motor and not a quick change blade system. But like I said earlier, that might actually be easier to work with than the blade system that's on this particular tool. So, each and everybody has their own personal wants and needs, but, depending on what your wants and needs are, well, this particular tool might not fill those needs all that well. So, it is what it is. Now, there is another aspect to this particular tool that was actually fairly useful, and that would be the sanding ability. This particular tool, because it vibrates so much, can actually produce quite a bit of, sanding capability, and it does a fairly good job at, sanding down the rough edges when you attach a sanding blade attachment to this particular tool. Now, with that being said, that doesn't mean that it's perfect in all regards, but it does do a fairly decent job, and as long as you're using high quality sandpaper, not the stuff that comes with the tool, it does, decent enough. So, it is what it is in that regard. But with that being said, let's recap with the pros and cons. And the first pro would be size. This is a fairly compact tool, and so that can be useful for if you are working in tight environments. So that is a pro in my opinion. Side handle. Now, this isn't a feature you see on a lot of name brand tools, and this can actually be very useful for if you need to maintain control because you are working on a very precise job. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Grip. The grip on this particular tool features very nice rubberized texture and is very easy to maintain your hold on, and so quite frankly, I'm very happy with the overall girth of the grip on this particular tool. So yeah, moving on. Power. Because this tool features a brushless motor, it can generate quite a bit of power even though it's only using 12 volts. So in my opinion, this is a pro. And I just mentioned it briefly, but the brushless motor is also another pro. The brushless motor will allow you to have a longer runtime, more power, and will give the tool a longer lifespan. So those are all pros in my opinion. And the first con would be the blade lock mechanism. Unfortunately, there are 4 things that are wrong with it. I explained earlier in the video what they were, so if you want to know what they were, go to that part of the video. But when it comes to the blade lock mechanism, I would definitely consider it to be a con. Okay, and last but not least, we have vibration. Unfortunately, this thing vibrates a ton, which can be useful, but it also is not that comfortable to hold barehanded, so a pair of gloves is going to be recommended. And that's it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular tool. Overall, it's a decent little tool. I don't think it's going to be the best overall multi-tool on the market, but it does have some useful features and it can come in handy. But unfortunately, that blade locking mechanism just makes it too much of a pain for me to really be able to recommend. As long as you can live with that particular, problem that this particular tool deals with, you know, it's not a half bad little tool. But for me personally, I have other multi-tools that I'm going to be using far more often because they're just easier to work with. And so this particular tool is probably going to get gifted to somebody else. So, you know, it is what it is, but at the end of the day, it's not the best option on the market, unfortunately. But the price isn't horrible, so, you know, it is what it is. And that is it for this particular video. Thanks for bearing with me. I have a bit of a sore throat this week, so I didn't exactly dive as deep as I wanted to on all subjects. So hopefully next time I'll be feeling better, and it'll be a little bit of a better quality video for you all. So until then, God bless.